Let's go to Houston, Texas, and speak to Dr. Craig Considine, who is a sociologist at Rice University. Dr. Considine, thank you very much for your time. What impact will that service have had in terms of what's required for relations between Muslim communities and non-Muslim communities to come to a point where people understand and accept without rancor that terrorism exists in many different forms across religions, races, and cultures? Because at the moment there seems to be an overriding feeling in most of the world that terrorism belongs to one particular culture.
Thank you very much for having me. I'll say this. I think the world is at a tipping point right now where the media is starting to address the fact that terrorism is not exclusive to any one religion. For many years now, people have been brainwashed to think that Muslims somehow have ownership over this term terrorism or terrorist. What we saw so unfortunately, and God rest the souls of those who passed in Christ's church, clearly this is an act of terrorism. And the world and the media is doing a great job of recognizing the fact that we have other forms of extremism and violence that is not exclusive to Muslims. But let me say this. New Zealand has been an exemplary nation in terms of how to respond to acts of violence. It's an extraordinary feat that the Prime Minister of New Zealand is exhibiting. And I'll say this, it's about humanity. People are starting to recognize that violence is impacting all sorts of people: mothers, fathers, children, brothers, sisters, neighbors, lawyers, doctors. And it's an amazing, I think, potential event that we have in front of us where people are starting to recognize that at the core, we are human beings. Before we're Muslims, before we're Christians, before we're any faith, any religion. It's a time of hope, I think, in a desperate time as well.
You referenced the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, and we've talked about this before. She's a very particular person. New Zealand's a very particular country. Its people are very reasonable. Jacinda Ardern has handled this, as you indicate, in a way that the rest of the world says should be an example to everybody else. But, well, what about Hungary? Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, says that Muslims are coming to my country to undermine Christianity. He's effectively closed his entire country off to immigrants who are fleeing war and terror in their homeland. Sebastian Kurz, in Austria. He's a right-wing chancellor who is also against new arrivals coming to his country. In the nation you're speaking to us from, Donald Trump says that there are people of Middle East origin coming from the southern border, where he's trying to build that wall to mainly keep Latinos out of the United States. He tweeted just a few months ago that people have been telling him that there are prayer rugs being found at that border. What he didn't seem to understand is that people will bring a rug because they want to put it over a barbed wire fence so that they don't cut their hands and their legs when they're trying to get over that border wall to live in the United States. So there are leaders around the world who are the complete opposite of Jacinda Ardern. How much space is there going to be left for them in the years that follow an event like this, which the world says we need to learn something from what's happened in Christchurch?
Excellent points. Recognizing the trend that we're seeing across the so-called Western world, the rise of far-right extremism. And I think the important point to recognize here is that politicians, unlike the Prime Minister of New Zealand, a lot of the politicians in the Western world are preying off of the ignorance and the hate that has been gaining steam for years, arguably since 9/11 and long before. This idea that somehow Muslim migrants or Muslims within a country are somehow a threat. But I'll say this, the victims, the martyrs that lost their lives and passed away in Christchurch were absolutely not violent. They were not a threat to so-called Western civilization. If anything, they are making massive contributions. Last night, I held a vigil at Rice University in Houston, Texas. and I listed the names of the 50 deceased people that passed away. And I also mentioned the contributions that they were making. We had engineers, we had doctors, we had scholars, we had school teachers, we had people of all walks of life coming to vouch for these deceased people, saying that these were some incredible people. So when we have these far-right politicians, they're just blatantly ignoring our common humanity and this idea that Muslims are just like the rest of humanity. They're making contributions to their society. They want to make contributions to their society because their faith is telling them to make contributions of society. And lastly, I'll say the Prime Minister, the fact that she's reading passages of the Quran and she's mentioning the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, that means so much to Muslims. And I really commend her for taking the action that she's taking.
You said at the start of this interview that we're at a tipping point. Have we actually passed that tipping point? Are we possibly now living in that era that Samuel Huntington said was coming, and that the clash of civilizations is here? His theory positing that wars would not in the future be fought between countries, but between cultures.
Unfortunately, we are there. We have been there, I think, for at least since 9/11, because politicians in so-called Western countries are blatantly adopting the rhetoric that Samuel Huntington is adopting. But what we are also witnessing, especially on social media and in news media and in communities where people are holding vigils and taking action and standing by their Muslim brothers and sisters, is what we may refer to as the dialogue of civilizations. It's the exact opposite of something like the clash of civilizations, where people are starting to realize that there is a gray space amongst humanity, where it's not black or white, it's not a binary, it's a common space where people recognize common principles: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. And people are starting to recognize that before anything, we are human beings, and that every civilization that has ever existed on Earth has not come through a vacuum, that it's been built on previous civilizations. This idea that the West, the Western world, has been influenced by Islam. Islam has been influenced by Western society as well. So there's a nuance to all this that I think is slowly coming out, and we're starting to realize that we actually have more in common than we think. And this idea of this far right extremism, and even on the opposite end of religious extremism, these are the people just trying to divide us and rip us away from our common humanity.
Dr. Craig Considine, I cannot thank you enough for your analysis. Thank you for joining us on TRT World. Appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. God bless. Thank you.